It was one of those nights where the soft clink of wine glasses and the low murmur of chatter in the background set the perfect tone for a luxury dinner. And the crowd in the restaurant was what you'd expect. Wealthy, polished, the type of place where people try to keep their voices down, even if their wallets speak a little too loudly. And then, in the midst of it all, there he was, Elon Musk, sitting at the corner booth, sipping on something dark, his posture casual, yet undeniably magnetic. His face was as you'd expect. Yet there was something more human about him than the larger-than-life figure everyone on TV and social media made him out to be. It was as if, for a moment, he wasn't the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire or the tech mogul trying to change the world. He was just a man, here for a quiet dinner, trying to enjoy a fleeting moment of anonymity. The room buzzed with whispers as people, some of them undoubtedly recognizing him, tried not to stare. Everyone knew who he was, but no one dared approach him. Well, almost no one. That was until a man walked in who looked completely out of place. His clothes were wrinkled, his shoes scuffed, and there was an intensity about him that made everyone in the room uneasy. He stood at the door for a moment, scanning the room. His eyes flicked over the tables, pausing when they landed on Musk, and without hesitation, he made his way straight to the booth. No introductions, no pleasantries. He stopped in front of the table, leaning forward slightly as if the weight of whatever he was about to say needed to be delivered with force. You. The man's voice cut through the room, loud enough that the conversations around them momentarily stilled. The anger was raw in his voice, but there was something else, something deeper, desperation, perhaps. His hands clenched in a fist by his sides, and his eyes locked on Musk with a fierce intensity that made everyone in the restaurant turn their attention toward him. "Do you even realize what you've done?" he spat, leaning over the table now, his breath a little too heavy. "People like you, people who sit up there in your fancy restaurants, in your golden towers, telling us all how we should live, how we should think. But you're just out here playing games with our lives, aren't you? You really think you're some sort of hero? You think that because you can launch a car into space, you're saving us? But you're not. You're just a man with too much power, a man who's so far removed from reality that you can't even see what you've done. You're the reason things are falling apart. You've put the world on a trajectory, and you're too busy being a billionaire to notice we're all crumbling under the weight of your so-called innovations." Musk had barely flinched at the outburst. He didn't look shocked, didn't look angry either. His expression was calm, but there was a shift in his eyes. For a moment, he didn't speak. He just watched the man with a quiet intensity, his lips pursed as if considering how to respond. The other diners watched, their voices dying down as the confrontation became impossible to ignore. Musk's colleagues, sitting across from him, shifted uncomfortably in their seat, glancing around at the tension building in the room. And then, in a voice much softer than anyone expected, Musk finally spoke. "You think I don't know that?" he asked, the weight of his words almost too heavy to bear. His tone was calm, but there was something in the way he spoke, an exhaustion, a truth that seemed to seep out from somewhere deep inside. "You think I don't wake up every day, knowing that I can't fix it all? That I'm not struggling to figure out what the right move is? You think I don't feel the weight of everything we're doing to the world, to the people, to the future?" He paused, his eyes not leaving the man's face. "I don't have all the answers. I don't even know if we're doing the right thing. But every day we try. We try because we believe that doing nothing is worse than making mistakes. And I'd rather make mistakes trying to do something than sit back and let the world fall apart. You might not like it. You might think I'm just another rich guy playing at being a hero. But you don't get to decide the price of progress. None of us do. We just try to keep moving forward." The man stood there for a moment, his anger flickering, shifting from outrage to something softer, something more uncertain. His fist slowly unclenched, and he took a step back, his gaze lingering on Musk for another long beat. The room stayed silent, the tension hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. People were waiting for some kind of explosion, for the situation to either escalate or dissolve into an awkward silence. But no one knew what would happen next. Not even Musk seemed to know. The room seemed to hold its breath. It was as if time had stretched thin, hanging on the edge of something no one could predict. The tension was palpable, each person in the restaurant glued to the scene unfolding at the corner booth. The waiter, standing in the middle of the room with a tray of drinks in his hand, hadn't moved a muscle. The usual hum of conversation had completely evaporated, and for the first time all night, it felt like the restaurant had shrunk down to a single moment, a single point of conflict between two people. It was no longer just a disagreement. It was something deeper, something unspoken. The man's face twisted. He seemed unsure, lost, as if the truth of what Musk had just said had hit him harder than anything he expected. He opened his mouth as though to retort, but no words came out. Instead, his hands trembled, the frustration written across his face. For a second, there was silence. The kind of silence that screams louder than any argument. The restaurant, still frozen, watched as Musk sat there, unflinching, looking at the man with a quiet sort of strength. The billionaire wasn't backing down, but he wasn't being defensive either. He wasn't playing the game the man expected. He wasn't reacting with anger or pushing back. "You think I'm part of the problem, don't you?" Musk asked, his voice quiet but piercing. There was no mockery, no condescension, just a calm, almost weary understanding. The man opened his mouth again, but didn't say anything. Musk continued, as though he were speaking to himself, more than anyone else. "You think I'm just another guy who's making millions while the rest of the world suffers. I get it. I hear it every day. I hear it from people in the streets, in my emails, in my DMs. I hear it from people who think that by being wealthy, I'm somehow exempt from the consequences. But you want to know the truth?" He leaned forward slightly, his gaze never leaving the man's eyes, piercing, not in an aggressive way, but in a way that made the man feel like he was being seen for the first time. "The truth is, I don't have all the answers. But I don't get to walk away from it either. None of us do." The man stared at Musk, still unsure of what to make of the response. The words seemed to weigh on him, each one sinking in deeper than he expected. He had come into the restaurant with so much anger, so much certainty that the problem was clear, that the man sitting in front of him was the villain of the story. He had been ready to unleash, to tear into Musk with everything he had, ready to expose him for what he saw as the root of all the issues the world faced. But now, as Musk spoke, there was a shift. Something inside him was beginning to unravel. The anger wasn't gone, but the certainty was. He didn't know what to feel anymore. The room was still watching, but now, instead of judgment or tension, there was curiosity. The waiter, still standing frozen with his tray, felt the change too. The energy had shifted from conflict to something else. It was as if the whole restaurant was suspended between two worlds, one where everything was wrong, where people like Musk were to blame for every problem, and another where everything wasn't so clear-cut. The man's hands trembled more now, his shoulders hunched, as if the weight of the world was suddenly heavier than he had realized. He glanced around the room, catching the eyes of several people who had been watching, waiting for his next move. But he couldn't seem to find a way out. He had come in here angry, sure of his position, certain of what Musk represented. But now, faced with the man himself, with the calmness and sincerity in his eyes, he wasn't so sure anymore. "You want to know what I see?" Musk's voice broke the silence again, low and measured. He wasn't talking to anyone else now. He wasn't performing for the audience in the restaurant. His eyes were fixed on the man in front of him, and there was no arrogance there, no superiority. Just a quiet, almost painful honesty. "I see someone who's angry because they feel powerless. I see someone who's struggling, trying to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense. I see someone who's afraid. Afraid that the systems we've created are too big to change. Afraid that no matter how hard we try, we'll always be stuck, always fighting an uphill battle." The man's breath hitched, and for the first time, his anger faltered. His hands stopped shaking, his chest rising and falling as if he were trying to swallow something he didn't know how to handle. Musk didn't wait for him to speak, didn't demand an answer. He just let the words hang there, a kind of invitation that the man didn't know how to accept. "But you're not alone in that," Musk said, his voice barely above a whisper. "None of us are. You think the people who are in my position don't struggle too? You think we don't feel the weight of the world on our shoulders every single day? It's easy to blame people like me. to point fingers and say that we're the reason things are the way they are. But the truth is, we're all in this together. And if we're ever going to fix anything, it won't be by tearing each other down. The man's lips parted, but no words came out. There was nothing left to say. The room, still watching, seemed to breathe again, the weight of the tension dissipating in small increments. Musk leaned back in his seat, finally breaking the silence completely, his hands clasped in front of him, his gaze softening, no longer directed at the man but somewhere else, perhaps inward. He wasn't trying to prove a point anymore. He wasn't defending his actions. He was just saying what he believed, what he truly felt. The man stood there for a moment longer, his eyes searching Musk's face, trying to reconcile everything he had come in expecting with what he was seeing now. It was almost as if the universe had turned a mirror in front of him, and he didn't know whether to look away or confront what he saw. For the first time that night, he felt small, not in the way that made him want to lash out, but in a way that left him speechless. The anger was still there, but now it was mixed with something else, regret maybe, or confusion. He didn't know. Finally, he took a step back. His body slumped, not in defeat, but in resignation. The fight had drained out of him, leaving behind a kind of hollow realization that everything wasn't as simple as he had thought. He didn't know what to do with that realization. He didn't know what came next, but he was no longer angry. He was just uncertain. The man stood there for a moment longer than anyone expected, his mind spinning as he processed what had just happened. He had come into this restaurant expecting to make a scene, to shout at Musk, to tear him down, to expose him for everything he believed he stood for. He had thought the billionaire was the villain, the one pulling the strings, the one responsible for all the things wrong in the world. But now, standing in front of him, watching Musk's calm demeanor and hearing the sincerity in his voice, he felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He didn't know what to do with himself anymore, what to believe. His hands, still trembling slightly, dropped to his sides, and for the first time, he felt exposed. Vulnerable. It was as if he had put on a mask for so long and had never realized how much it weighed until it was taken off. The restaurant, which had been holding its breath in a stunned silence, began to stir again. The soft murmur of conversation resumed, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. No one was quite sure what had just happened, but it was clear that something had changed, not just for the man, but for everyone in the room. It was as if the whole situation had forced everyone to confront their own beliefs, their own assumptions. People were whispering to one another, their voices tinged with uncertainty. No one was talking about Musk anymore. No one was talking about the man who had exploded at him. They were talking about what had just happened between them. The unspoken tension that had passed from one person to the next, that had made everyone feel like they had to choose a side. The truth, as it always did, had become a little murky. Musk didn't move. He didn't push for a response, didn't try to fill the air with more words. He simply sat there, waiting, as if allowing the man to find his own way out of the conversation. His colleague, who had been sitting across from him through the entire exchange, was silent as well, but the expression on their face had shifted. They had witnessed this moment just like everyone else, and their gaze seemed to reflect the same confusion, the same realization that something bigger had just unfolded. There was no way to ignore the change in the air. It wasn't just a personal confrontation. It was a challenge to everything everyone had believed to be true. The man looked around the restaurant, his gaze falling on the faces of the other diners. He saw the curiosity in their eyes, the way they watched him, the way they watched Musk. It was as if the entire room was waiting for him to do something, anything, to justify his anger, to prove that he had a reason for coming here, for confronting Musk in the first place. He could feel their eyes on him, heavy with judgment, but not the kind of judgment he had expected. This wasn't the condemnation he thought he would receive for standing up to someone he saw as a symbol of everything wrong in the world. This was different. This was a kind of questioning, a kind of disbelief. They didn't know what to make of him. And suddenly, he didn't know what to make of himself. His chest tightened as he tried to force words past the lump in his throat. But nothing came out. He opened his mouth, but his thoughts seemed to scatter, running in too many directions for him to grasp. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore, wasn't sure what he thought he was going to get from this encounter. All he knew was that the rage he had carried with him for so long, rage that had fueled his every action, every decision, Every step he took was now gone. And in its place, there was nothing but silence. It was an empty space, an uncomfortable vacuum that left him feeling more exposed than he had ever felt in his life. He looked at Musk again. There was no anger in the billionaire's eyes. There was no contempt. Musk wasn't looking at him with judgment or with the kind of self-righteousness that so many people in positions of power tended to display. There was only calm, only quiet understanding. The man's mind raced. How could Musk not be angry? How could he sit there, so composed, in the face of such vitriol? Was it because he was used to it? Or was it because, deep down, he understood something the man didn't? The more he thought about it, the more his doubt began to settle in, weighing down the last remnants of his anger. Musk's voice broke the silence again, cutting through the chaos in the man's head. "You think I don't see it?" Musk asked, his tone steady. "You think I don't see the anger in your eyes? The frustration? The desire to fix something you feel is broken? I've been where you are. I felt all of that. But it doesn't help anyone, does it? It doesn't change anything." The man's heart thudded in his chest. Musk was speaking to him now, directly, but it wasn't the way he had expected. It wasn't some kind of lecture or justification. It wasn't an attempt to placate him. It was just understanding, as though Musk had somehow seen through him, past his anger, past his frustration, and understood exactly what he was feeling. For a moment, the man felt something inside him twist, a knot of guilt, or maybe shame, or maybe it was a mix of both. He didn't know what to do with it. He didn't know how to handle the way Musk's words were landing in his chest, one after another, like soft punches that made him realize just how little he understood about the very things he had spent so much of his life railing against. The moment dragged on, the silence stretching between them. The man felt like he was suffocating, drowning in the weight of his own thoughts. Musk didn't push him to answer. He just sat there still as ever, waiting. Finally, the man spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, his words shaky. "I don't know what to do with this, with all of it. I don't know what I'm supposed to do anymore." Musk didn't offer a quick solution, didn't try to hand him an easy answer. Instead, he simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of the moment. "None of us do," he said, his voice soft. "We're all just figuring it out as we go. And maybe that's the point. Maybe it's okay to not have all the answers." The man's eyes flickered with something like realization, something like acceptance. It wasn't complete, not yet, but it was there. And for the first time that night, he didn't feel the need to shout, to blame, or to point fingers. He felt human, just like Musk, just like everyone else. And maybe that was the point. As the silence settled, as the man sat there, still processing everything that had been said, a voice suddenly broke through the stillness. The interruption was so sharp, so jarring, that for a moment, everyone in the restaurant tensed, unsure of what was happening or who was speaking. The newcomer didn't seem to care about the atmosphere, didn't seem to recognize the delicate moment that had unfolded in the booth. Instead, they barged into the conversation like a freight train, not waiting for anyone's permission. "You're both full of it," the voice rang out, and everyone turned their heads in unison. It was a woman, early 30s, dressed in the kind of casual, yet stylish clothes that seemed to scream, "I don't care about fashion, but I still look good." Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried an undeniable weight of certainty, and it caught everyone off guard. The man at the table blinked, as if trying to make sense of the intrusion. Musk raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting slightly, but he didn't speak. The woman continued, her eyes locked on them both, her hands braced on the back of the chair across from the man, as though she intended to take it for herself. "I've been listening to the two of you go back and forth," she said, her voice laced with both irritation and amusement. "And it's honestly just exhausting. You've both got your head so far up your own ideas of the world that you can't see what's really going on. You," she pointed at the man, "are angry, sure. You think the world's out to get you, that people like him." She jerked her thumb toward Musk. "Are the ones pulling the strings while you're stuck here. And you've got your little self-righteous speech about how everyone is in this together, but you can't even acknowledge the very real problems that keep people like him on top and everyone else stuck beneath." The man blinked in disbelief, not quite sure if he was supposed to be offended or not. His anger, which had simmered down considerably in the past few minutes, flared back up, but he wasn't sure if he could direct it at her. She was just a stranger. But there was something in the way she spoke, something in her harsh clarity, that unsettled him, made him feel exposed again. It wasn't that she was wrong. It was that she was making everything feel simpler, as if all of their complicated emotions and struggles were just part of the same tired song. The tension that had filled the room moments before suddenly snapped back into place. Musk's face, however, remained impassive. He looked at the woman with the same quiet attention he had given the man, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no challenge, just a curious stillness. "Go on," he said, his voice calm, but with a sharp edge, like a man holding back a larger storm of words. "I'm listening." The woman scoffed, not backing down. "Oh, you want me to spell it out for you?" She leaned forward, her fingers gripping the chair in front of her, as though the conversation were an object she could physically move. "You talk about how everyone's in this together, but you both know damn well that isn't true. You," she turned back to the man, "are angry because you're stuck. And you," she jerked her head towards Musk, "you're angry because you think that your wealth is the solution, when in reality, it's part of the problem." There was an edge of something else in her voice now, something personal, a bitterness that made it clear she wasn't simply observing the conversation as a neutral party. "You think your tech is going to fix the world?" she continued, her voice rising slightly with each word. "That's all anyone like you ever thinks. You build your little rockets, you electrify a few cars, but you never see the bigger picture. You think you're saving the world when all you're doing is playing God with it. You, with your billions, and you," she turned back to the man, "with your anger, neither of you are any closer to understanding what it's like to be someone who's struggling. You think you've got it all figured out, but you're just playing your roles." Musk's jaw tightened, and for the first time, his usual composure seemed to crack. "And you think you know better?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous, but not with fury. "With something deeper. You think I don't know what it's like to struggle? You think I've never had my own battles, my own doubts, my own questions about how the world works?" The woman didn't flinch. "Oh, I'm sure you have," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "But the difference is, you're not living in the world you're building. You're not going home every day, struggling just to pay rent or feed your kids. You get to play in a sandbox, and you call it progress. But let me tell you something. You're not the one who gets buried under the weight of your own system." Musk didn't respond immediately. He sat there for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her, his eyes narrowing as though he were considering her words, weighing them against everything he believed. The man, who had been silent throughout the exchange, suddenly felt a pang of guilt, as though he had been caught up in a conversation that was about to get much bigger than he ever intended. He couldn't help but agree with some of what the woman said. His anger had always been about the systems in place, and how he had been left behind by them. But hearing it from her, with the rawness and venom in her voice, made him question how deep the problem really went, and how far the distance was between him, Musk, and people like her. Finally, Musk spoke, and his voice was colder, sharper now. "You think I'm blind to all of this?" he asked, his gaze never leaving the woman. "You think I don't see the flaws, the inequality, the people who are left behind? You think I'm blind to the fact that my wealth, my position, creates a distance between me and those who don't have it? But that doesn't mean I'm not trying. That doesn't mean I don't care about the people who are struggling. But if you think for 1 second that tearing others down, people who are trying to do something to make things better, is the answer, you've got another thing coming." The woman's expression flickered for a moment, as if she hadn't expected him to fight back like this. She stood frozen, unsure whether to continue the confrontation or walk away. Musk's words had struck deeper than she had anticipated, making her own doubts creep into the edges of her anger. The tension in the room shifted again, this time a more complex mix of frustration, defensiveness, and something else, a recognition of just how complicated everything really was. The conversation wasn't just about them anymore. It had spiraled out of control, becoming a reflection of everything wrong with the world they were all trying to navigate. And no one seemed to have an answer. The silence stretched, and for a moment, it felt as though the whole world had stopped to listen. The woman and Musk stood locked in their exchange, both sides unwilling to give in. but neither wanting to fully escalate the argument. The man, still sitting between them, felt as though he were watching a storm roll in, one that wasn't just between them, but one that mirrored the storm in his own heart. He had never imagined that the conversation would turn this way, that it would spiral into something much more intense, much more personal than he had anticipated. But here they were, all three of them, caught in a dance of words, a battle of ideologies, and he was starting to realize that no matter how loud they shouted, no matter how much they argued, none of it was going to bring him the resolution he sought. He wasn't sure why, but suddenly he felt exhausted. The anger that had once seemed like a beacon of righteousness was now dull and heavy, like something that had been dragging him down without him realizing it. It was as if the fire that had been burning so fiercely inside him had been snuffed out, and in its place was a deep emptiness, a quiet space where he had to confront the uncomfortable reality of what was left. The anger had been his armor for so long, but now, without it, he wasn't sure who he was anymore. He wanted something more, something beyond the shouting, beyond the blame, beyond the divisions. But he didn't know how to ask for it. Musk shifted in his seat, his posture relaxing slightly as he looked at the woman across from him. And for the first time, the man saw something other than calmness in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't frustration. It was something else, something like weariness, but deeper than that, like a tiredness born not just from physical exertion, but from the weight of carrying the world's expectations on your shoulders every single day. Musk had lived with the expectation that he had to fix everything, that he had to change the world, and the realization that it was not as simple as making a few big decisions, as pushing a few buttons, was starting to hit him harder than he had expected. The weight of it was heavier than any rocket he had ever launched. "Look," Musk said, his voice softer now, stripped of the defensive edge that had been there moments before. "I get it. I get that there's a lot of anger out there. I understand that people are struggling. But fighting each other, tearing each other down, doesn't solve anything. It doesn't make anything better. It just makes the divide wider." The woman, whose posture had been rigid just moments before, seemed to deflate at his words. She had come into the conversation with all the certainty of someone who thought they had the answers, but now there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. She didn't respond immediately, but the tension in her shoulders had loosened slightly, and the anger in her expression had softened, though it hadn't disappeared. The man, sitting silently between them, felt as if the room had grown even quieter. It wasn't a silence that held anger or judgment. It was a quiet where everyone was left alone with their thoughts. For a long moment, neither the woman nor Musk spoke again. The man, who had felt so insignificant just a few moments before, now found himself stepping back from the situation, trying to make sense of everything he had witnessed. He had spent so much time focusing on the anger, the frustration, and the injustice that he hadn't stopped to think about the people on the other side, the ones who were trying, in their own way, to make things better, to change the system from the inside out. Maybe they didn't have all the answers, but neither did he. And that realization hit him harder than any argument ever could. "I didn't come here to pick a fight," the woman said finally, her voice quieter now, more reflective than when she had first interrupted the conversation. "I came here because I'm tired. I'm tired of seeing the same patterns over and over again. People who have the power to make change, but they don't. People who are stuck in their own privilege, unaware of how it affects the rest of us. But I guess I was wrong to think that making someone feel small would change anything." Musk didn't say anything right away, but his eyes softened, and for a moment, it felt like they were all simply existing in the same space, not as adversaries, but as people, flawed, imperfect, trying to make sense of the world around them. It was strange, this quiet understanding that had emerged in place of the anger, but it was also relieving. It was as if, in this one moment, the weight of their expectations had lifted just enough for them all to breathe. The man, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with all this," he said, his voice uncertain but not as shaky as it had been before. "I've spent so long angry at people like him," he nodded toward Musk, "but I've never stopped to think about what that actually means, what it really solves." The woman glanced at him, a hint of acknowledgement in her gaze. "None of us have the answers," she said softly, her words not judgmental, but understanding. We're all just figuring it out. The difference is that some people are willing to admit it and others aren't. Some of us try to make change, but it's never enough. It's always a fight. Musk leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. It's not about being perfect. None of us are. But if we're not willing to listen to each other, if we're not willing to have these conversations, even the uncomfortable ones, then nothing changes. Nothing gets better. The man felt a strange calm wash over him, something he hadn't expected after the whirlwind of emotions that had come before. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't a simple answer to all of his frustrations. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he understood something important. Change wasn't about having all the answers. It wasn't about defeating the other side or proving a point. It was about coming together, about listening, and about being willing to ask difficult questions, even when the answers were uncomfortable. The woman nodded, standing up and gathering her things. "I'm not saying everything's okay," she said, her voice a little softer now. "But maybe we're all just trying to figure it out. And maybe that's enough for now." She turned and walked away, leaving the man and Musk to sit in the quiet that followed. The man looked over at Musk, who met his gaze with a nod. No words necessary. For the first time that night, the man felt a glimmer of something else. Hope, maybe, or maybe just understanding. Whatever it was a start. As the woman walked away, the air seemed to grow heavier. The man and Musk remained seated, but the conversation had shifted in a way neither of them had expected. The tension, which had felt so palpable moments before, now felt like a distant memory. The man's thoughts churned, and he found himself reflecting on everything that had just happened. The anger, the accusations, the sudden clarity. It was almost too much to process, but there was a piece of something that lingered in his mind, something new. He looked at Musk, who was still leaning back in his chair, but now his posture was different. He was no longer the untouchable billionaire with all the answers. He was just another person, sitting across from him, trying to make sense of the same broken world. "I've spent so much time angry at you," the man said, his voice quieter than it had been all night. "And maybe I should have been angry at the system, not the people trying to play by the rules of it." Musk met his gaze, his expression unreadable at first, but after a moment his lips curled into something that resembled a small, knowing smile. It wasn't a smug grin, but a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding. "Yeah, the system's messed up, but it's also the system that keeps us all going, whether we like it or not. Doesn't make it right, just makes it real." The man nodded slowly. There was nothing else to say. The air between them wasn't thick with anger anymore. It was quieter, more reflective. And for the first time, the man realized that the fight he had been looking for wasn't the one he needed. He didn't need to tear Musk down, didn't need to prove he was right. What he needed was to find his own peace, his own way forward. Then, just as he was about to speak again, Musk looked over at him, his voice unusually soft. "I get it, though. The frustration, the anger. Sometimes you think you're doing all the right things, but it still feels like you're running in place. And the harder you try, the more you realize it's not enough." The words struck the man deeply. For a moment, he didn't know how to respond, but then something inside of him clicked. He had always thought that if he could just fight hard enough, things would change. But maybe the real change came from looking at the problem differently. Not through the lens of anger, but through understanding. "I guess we're all just trying to find the right way," the man said, his voice almost a whisper. Musk nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. "Yeah, and sometimes the right way isn't the loudest way. It's the quiet, steady kind of change. The kind that happens when you stop trying to win the fight and start asking how to fix the problem." They sat there for a few moments, each lost in their thoughts. The weight of their previous arguments had faded, replaced by something heavier, something that had a hint of hope, of possibility. As the man stood to leave, he glanced at Musk one last time. Their eyes met, not in challenge, but in mutual respect. Neither had won, and maybe neither of them would ever have all the answers, but the truth was clearer now. There was no simple fix. There was no easy way to solve the world's problems. But perhaps the first step was simply to acknowledge that they all needed to be part of the conversation, to hear each other's frustrations, and to try, in whatever way they could, to make things better. And as the man stepped out of the restaurant, he felt lighter somehow, still unsure of how to change the world, but ready to start with himself. He didn't have all the answers, but that was okay, because now he knew that maybe the real solution was just finding the courage to listen.